Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion, Maximising Your Clean Fuel Regulation Benefits, which is designed to help you understand Canada's carbon credits and how you can benefit from them. I'm Nino Di Cara, founder of Electric Autonomy, and I'm delighted to introduce today's webinar, which is brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, 3 Degrees. 3 Degrees is a leader in North American transportation, in the North American transportation incentive markets, and is at the forefront of helping companies navigate Canada's groundbreaking clean fuels regulation. We're grateful to our friends at 3 Degrees for their partnership. Before we get started, I'll take a moment to acknowledge that our work at Electric Autonomy is conducted from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Well, I'm very happy to introduce to you our featured expert speakers today, and I'm pleased that they're all joining us now. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Dave Meyer, Director of Transportation Markets at 3 Degrees. Dave brings over a decade of experience in commercial development, process optimization, engineering, project implementation, and corporate strategy. He continues to successfully expand 3 Degrees transportation markets business and is passionate about enabling companies to take urgent action on climate change in the transportation sector. Thanks for joining us today, Dave. And we also have Scott Vazzana, Senior Development Manager at 3 Degrees. Scott's role is to help others quantify and monetize their transportation emission reductions from road, rail, maritime, and aviation operations. Scott has been working at the intersection of climate, energy, and transportation for more than 25 years, most recently working with the largest global exchange for environmental commodities. Scott serves as the conduit between 3 Degrees clients and the resources they have to offer. And finally, my colleague Emma Jarratt, Executive Editor of Electric Autonomy, who will be moderating the discussion and the Q&A that follows today's presentation. So a warm welcome to you all. And just a message to the audience that today's format will be a presentation by Dave and Scott, followed by a Q&A session moderated by Emma. Many of you in the audience have already submitted literally dozens of questions through the registration process, so thank you for that. And Emma has those and will be presenting those to the 3 Degrees team. But we'd still love to hear your questions live. And you can do that with the Q&A button that you should see at the bottom of your screen. And so, yeah, enter your questions in there. You can upvote them and so on. If you would like to make a comment, and if you're not asking a question, please use the chat box. And that's a great way of engaging with other attendees and sharing ideas in there. So questions in the Q&A, general chat in the chat box. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to Dave to kick things off with the 3 Degrees presentation.
Great, thanks Nino, and thanks to the rest of the Electric Autonomy team for putting this event on and having us here today. Want to spend a few minutes this morning talking about the clean fuel regulations in Canada, what they are, how they work, how they can benefit folks who are looking to transition to low carbon or zero emissions vehicles, and the work that 3 Degrees does in that space. So I will kick off with a few slides. All right, hopefully you all can see this. So as Nino mentioned, my name is Dave Meyer. I head up the transportation markets business here at 3 Degrees. I've been with the company for about 4.5 years, focused on helping folks access incentives under what we call generically clean fuel standard programs, which includes the Canada CFR, the British Columbia LCFS, and programs in the US, the California LCFS, Oregon CFP, and Washington CFS. I'll give a quick intro of 3 degrees, and then we'll jump into a discussion of the CFR. So 3 degrees, our mission is to make it possible for businesses and their customers to take urgent action on climate change, and everything that we do is really oriented around that. To that end, we offer solutions across the full greenhouse gas chain, so scopes 1, 2, and 3. And what we're going to be talking about today primarily fits both into scope 1 and scope 3, depending on where you sit kind of in the value chain. But again, we also offer solutions around scope 2. 3 degrees, for example, is the largest supplier of voluntary RECs in North America. And we do strategy consulting kind of across all of these scopes to help entities figure out how to meet some of the ambitious targets that have been set with respect to reducing emissions. In the transportation space, in particular, as I mentioned, we operate in clean fuel standard programs, and we operate as what's known as an aggregator. What that means is that we basically take on the reporting rights and responsibilities for the entities that we work with, and we manage all of the reporting requirements under the programs, any verification requirements that might exist. Make sure credits get issued timely, the credits get sold, and then we share the revenue with the entities that we're working with. We have a large presence in this space, as I mentioned, kind of across the programs in North America, and continuing to grow as the Canada program develops and comes online. So with that, we'll dive into the CFR program specifically. And as Nina mentioned, we do have some questions that were submitted prior to the webinar, but certainly welcome you all to submit any additional questions that might come up throughout the presentation. Want to make sure that we engage with those as much as we can. So to start with, high level, what is the CFR? So the Clean Fuel Regulations is an approach that the Canadian government has taken to reduce transportation emissions. And the way they do that is by setting targets for what's known as carbon intensity, where those targets decline over time. Carbon intensity is basically a life cycle assessment of the emissions produced from transportation fuel. And it represents what's referred to as a well-to-wheels approach. So what that means is that we take a look at every step in the process, from, if we're talking about fossil fuels, pulling the crude oil out of the ground, refining it, turning it into finished fuels that are then distributed, dispensed into vehicles, and then burned. The emissions at kind of each step of that process are accounted for to come up with that carbon intensity value. The CFR program establishes a target of a 15% reduction in carbon intensity by 2030. And it came into full effect in about halfway through 2023, July 1st, 2023. And what I mean by that is, prior to July 1st, 2023, entities were eligible to generate credits, but deficit generation started in July of 2023. So the obligated parties started accruing their obligations then. And as I mentioned, the way the program works is it sets a carbon intensity target each year, and that carbon intensity target kind of declines year over year. What ends up happening then is you create a market, right? So if you're a producer of fossil fuels, the fuel that you are producing and selling has a carbon intensity that is greater than the target, and therefore you generate deficits. If you have a low carbon fuel, whether that be hydrogen, electricity, renewable diesel, things like that, your carbon intensity is below the target and therefore generate credits. At the end of each year, then the deficit holders have to offset their obligation by procuring credits. And that's what creates the market. So it's, I think, important to note here that this is a market, which means that prices move, right? So this isn't like a carbon tax where a price is fixed at a certain value over time. It is dependent on kind of the supply and demand dynamics within the market. And we've already seen that within the Canada program. Prices started in the early days of the program around $200 Canadian, and the current market is probably closer to about 125 to 135 Canadian, as folks have started to see data on the performance of the program. For today's conversation, we're really going to be focused on the EV space. As I mentioned, this program applies to all low carbon fuels, whether they be electricity, hydrogen, liquid biofuels, renewable natural gas. All of those things are eligible to generate credits. But for the purposes of our conversation today, we're really going to be focused on the electric vehicle space. So with that kind of perspective in mind, the biggest question is who is actually eligible to generate credits. And within the EV space, it's really split into two categories, what they refer to as a charging network operator or a charging site host. So a charging network operator is basically an entity that makes charging available either for public use or for residential use. And in the charging network operator case, the credit generating entity is the entity that owns the data that is associated with that charger. If it's available for public use, that charger also has to be kind of made available on an app so that people know that it exists. But in the residential case, again, it's just whoever owns the data. And there's a question about whether home EV chargers are eligible. And yes, home EV chargers are eligible. Again, the credit generators, whoever owns the data associated with that charger. There's also a credit reinvestment requirement for the charging network operator category, where 100% of the credit proceeds must be reinvested in either expanding the charger network or reducing the cost to own and operate an EV. So that information has to be documented and shared with the regulator, Environment and Climate Change Canada, on an annual basis. The other category here that's eligible to generate credits is the charging site host. And really, the definition here is kind of a negative. It's basically anybody who isn't a charging network operator. But this can primarily be thought of as entities who have chargers that are really meant for private use. So, for example, if somebody has a fleet of delivery vehicles and they have chargers at their warehouse to charge those vehicles, that would be an example of charging site host. In that case, the credits are generated by the entity that owns or leases the charger and has the right to have it installed on their site. In the charging site host category, there are no credit spend requirements. So you don't have to meet that kind of reinvestment requirement that is put on the charging network operators. The follow-on question then, of course, is, okay, well, how much is this program potentially worth? And as with most things, the answer is it depends. When we think about credit generation in the CFR, It really depends on three pieces of information. How much fuel was dispensed, what kind of vehicle used that fuel, and how clean was that fuel. In the case of electricity, basically the regulator distinguishes between light and heavy duty vehicles. So if the curb weight is below 6,000 pounds, it's a light duty vehicle. If it's above 6,000 pounds, it's a heavy duty vehicle. And then in terms of how clean is the fuel, it actually varies by province, and it varies quite significantly by province. So the numbers that are presented here are making an assumption where we're basically using kind of the average grid carbon intensity value for the three most populous provinces, partly because those provinces are very clean, and the grids in those provinces are very clean, and so they have a relatively high credit generation rate. If you were to look at this analysis in Alberta, for example, it would look very different because the grid in Alberta is not as clean. But you can see here, there's quite a range of value that different vehicles could qualify for. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to how much is that vehicle used. So things like over-the-road Class 8 semi-tractors that are used very heavily are going to be able to generate a significant amount of credit value, whereas something like a box truck that might be used kind of off and on intermittently and isn't as power hungry, might not generate as much credit revenue. But these are kind of representative estimates, and we'd be happy to engage with any of you on your specific situation to help you kind of better understand, what this looks like specifically for you. So in terms of how the program actually works, right? How do we go from, okay, I charged my whatever it is, let's say it's an electric school bus, to actually getting money out of the program. So the first step in this, of course, is the activity actually happening, right? So over the course of the year, you track how many kilowatt hours are dispensed out of the charger into the vehicle. And it is worth noting here that while we typically think about in the EV space, the vehicle as being the thing that we actually care about, from a regulatory perspective, the thing they actually care about is the charger. So when we are thinking about data collection, reporting, all of those kinds of things, that is based on what's happening at the charger level. So we're tracking charging activity from the charger over the course of the year. It's also one thing that's worth noting is credit generation can begin the day after an entity is registered in the program. So even if you've been charging a vehicle since January 1st of this year, if you're not registered in the program yet, you're only going to be able to claim the charging starting on the day after you register. So time is a bit of a factor here in terms of, you want to get signed up kind of as quickly as you can to make sure that revenue is able to flow as soon as possible, and you're able to capture as much activity as possible. So once the year is done, then, right, we collect all of that charging data over the course of the year. We then aggregate the data by charger and kind of process it, put it in the format that ECCC, again, Environment and Climate Change Canada, the program regulator, wants to see. And there is another important step here, which is verification. So under the CFR program, before any credits can be generated, the data that is reported to the regulator has to be verified. So the annual report is due to the regulator by April 30th of each year, and it has to be verified in advance of that date. So it's a pretty tight timeline for kind of getting the data processed, getting it reviewed. Verification also entails site visits. Not every site has to be visited. They can put together what's known as a sampling plan where they can kind of choose which sites they're going to visit, but it does entail site visits. So it's quite an intense process. And I see there's a question about verification fees. Verification fees can be significant, especially if you don't have a lot of charging activity. And that's actually what we think is one of the benefits of working with a company like 3 Degrees. Not only do we manage that verification process for you, including choosing the verifier, working with them to developing a plan, overseeing the verification process, but the fees don't grow linearly with the scope of the work that they're doing. So basically what that means is that on a per charger basis, your verification costs are lower if you're working with an entity that has kind of greater verification, a greater scope of verification. So once verification is complete, the data gets submitted to the regulator reviews it, they then issue the credits, and then the credits are sold into the market. And then 3 Degrees, the way we typically work is on a revenue share basis where we keep a portion of the value that's generated and remit the vast majority of it to our partners for the activity that they have generated. So the way that our process works, kind of keeping with that cycle that we showed, we want to make sure that we're identifying everything that's eligible, right? We're talking specifically here about EV charging, but we want to make sure that it's not just necessarily over the road vehicles that are eligible. Off-road vehicles are also eligible. So we want to make sure to understand kind of the full scope of the activity that you have to make sure that we're then putting together the right plan for data collection and reporting to make sure that we're generating as much credit value as possible. We'll then oversee the reporting and compliance requirements, make sure that we're doing data assurance, quality assurance on the data that we receive, make sure that we're working with verifiers as needed to make sure that everything stays on schedule. And then, we sell the credits once they are issued and then share the proceeds as I mentioned. So that's kind of the overview of the program. So if you're already convinced and want to work with 3 Degrees, then I would ask you to reach out to Scott, who's on the call with me, whose contact information is here, and he can help walk through this with you, help you get set up into the program. Yeah, we'll stop there, and I think move into the Q&A session.
Thanks so much, David. That was great. I've had the pleasure of listening to you do these sorts of talks twice now, and I learn an enormous amount each time. So very much appreciate you being here today to keep spreading the knowledge. As alluded to earlier, we have a shocking number of questions. So this is obviously an area that people are very curious about. We'll try to get through as many as we can, but please keep them coming. I am monitoring them on an ongoing basis. All right, so we'll start off with one of the questions submitted in the pre-registration stage, because I think it positions us well to get into the other more specifics of how the program works. But basically the question is, are these programs susceptible to the changing winds in politics? And particularly, Dave, I know you're in the US, we have elections happening very soon on both sides of the border within the next 18 months. What's going to happen to these programs if governments change?
Yeah, great question. So I'll confine my answer to the Canadian context because I think that's what most of you are most interested in. Again, prefacing with the fact that I sit in the US, so I'm giving my somewhat informed opinion as an outside observer. So yeah, I think you all are aware of kind of the situation on the ground, right? The current ruling coalition at the federal level, not super popular. It looks like the conservatives are likely to win in the upcoming elections, and they've been pretty vocal or pretty direct that they are going to get rid of the carbon tax, at least at the retail fuel level. So that, seems pretty well assured if they were to win the election. The question then becomes, what's going to happen to the CFR? And there was a member of the Conservative Party, or a senior member of the Conservative Party, who recently came out and basically said that if the Conservatives win, that they are likely to look at eliminating the CFR as well. Now, my sense, based on speaking with folks who are a little bit closer to this up in Canada, is that's actually relatively unlikely to happen. That if the Conservatives were to win, it's likely that the CFR would be reformed in some way, but probably not eliminated. And you see this happen, we've seen this happen a lot in US programs where the fossil fuel interests kick and scream and complain about these new programs that come into effect. But once they do come into effect, they figure out ways to participate in them and get value from them. And we're starting to see that, right? There was actually a recent announcement about, I believe it's Imperial Oil converting one of their refineries into a renewable diesel facility. And so once the fossil fuel interests start to see benefit from the program, that kind of entrenches it and makes it a little harder to get rid of. So that's kind of my best guess at this point, is that should the Conservatives win, the CFR likely won't go away, but it will likely be changed in some way. It's also worth noting that in British Columbia, the government there had, to be clear, there's a provincial level program similar to the CFR in British Columbia called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, the LCFS. That's been in place there for quite some time. And historically, the government there has been very adamant that that program is going to stay in place, that it's working, that it's doing what they want it to do. More recently, they've essentially said, whatever the winning party does in the upcoming federal elections, they're going to follow suit. So it is worth noting, if you're in British Columbia, that there could be a trickle-down effect to you based on what happens at the federal level. So that's, I think, the extent of my knowledge of Canadian politics as it relates to these programs. So I think I will stop there.
Hey, Dave, I may jump in and add something real quick if I may.
Sure.
So these programs exist, and in my travels and work and helping others onboard and access the benefits of them, it's not uncommon to hear opinions about the programs, some good, some bad, some for it, some against it. Understandably so. I don't think 3 degrees is not necessarily asking you to be a believer in the program or the concept, but I will just say that the money is there, it's available. As Dave mentioned, that the BC LCFS program, the CFR, they're stackable programs. You can take advantage of both at the same time. In addition to that, if you qualify for other grants or other incentives, participating in these programs does not preclude you from accessing those funds as well. So get as much as you can. Again, you don't have to necessarily believe in that part of the green. The money is out there. You might as well take advantage and try to help offset your TCO if you're going to be making this transition.
Thanks both. With that, there's money on the table. I think everyone hears that and like, oh, like, you know, can I get it? So there are a few questions just trying to clarify some of the nuances around who actually is eligible. So we'll start with a follow-up question, Dave, to one of the statements you made in your presentation about people who own or lease, or groups that own or lease the chargers. So the question is, anytime the chargers are leased by a party, they're owned by someone else or a different company. Which one is actually eligible for claiming the credit?
Basically, whoever gets to it first is the real answer. That's the way the regulator is going to process it. They look at it. They're basically looking at the serial number that's associated with the charger to kind of distinguish it as the unique identifier for each charger, and they it typically goes in first out. So whoever gets it registered first, they will deny future registrations of that same equipment. That's typically it. The reality is either the lessee or the lessor can register, and at the end of the day, it's going to come down to whoever basically gets it in first.
You weren't kidding about time being of the essence. All right, and then some questions about, again, with who is actually eligible to claim these credits. A lot of questions around residential charges. I think there's maybe a bit of uncertainty about if, for example, on myself, if I have a charger, could I come to 3 Degrees and say I want to claim carbon credits on these? A, would I be eligible? And B, is a single household enough of a volume for a company like 3 Degrees to make it worthwhile?
Yeah, so on the first part of the question, I would say the answer actually probably not, because probably when you buy the charger, you're, as part of the agreement, you're probably making some data agreement with whoever is selling you the charger that they have the rights to the data from that charger. So it's unlikely actually that as a homeowner, you with that has installed an EV charger, that you actually would be eligible from that perspective. From a scope perspective, yeah, I think it would be really hard for us to justify taking on an individual homeowner. The average residential EV charges about 3 MWh a year, which, depending on your jurisdiction, is going to translate to, I don't know, 4 credits or something like that. So call it $500. That's probably not going to cover verification costs. So that would be a challenge.
I do have a volume question on the individual owners front, but
Sure.
Not to overly drill into this, and this actually is my example. I'm fortunate enough to have home charging, but I didn't buy a charger. I just had a level 2 cable with a plug attached to it come with my vehicle, and I just needed the socket installed, which is what I did. So setting aside the fact that I'm a very small volume, carbon credit generator on my own, people in that scenario, would that setup be eligible for a carbon credit?
Probably not. The way that ECCC defines a charger is basically something that is able to collect data and is connected in some way, right? A smart charger. So if you just have a charging cable or something like that, you're not really going to be able to register that. We've seen greater flexibility in other programs. In the US programs, for example, we have instances where somebody has a depot, right? And they have a bunch of buses that charge at that depot. And they use the meter as the thing that defines the quantity of electricity that's dispensed. But under the CFR, they've been pretty strict on their definition that it's really only smart chargers that can be registered.
And sorry, I'm sidebarring myself once more for my volume question, but just quickly, because you just actually used the phrase kilowatt hours dispensed. Somebody asked, how is that measured? Is it what goes into the charger or what goes into the vehicle?
Whatever is reported by the charger is what gets reported. So I know there's different losses, right, between the meter and the charger, between the charger and the EV, but whatever the charger reports as the kilowatt hour total that it has dispensed is what gets reported.
Got it. Finally getting to my my point. Just closing the loop on residential applications. Sure, one household isn't enough. That makes sense from a maths perspective. What happens when you have volume in a condo or an apartment? We multi-unit residential buildings. Are they eligible to generate credits off of their chargers?
Yes.
How would they do about doing that?
Yeah, so they fall under still that kind of charging network operator designation under the federal program, and so would get registered like any other kind of residential charger.
Okay.
I will just make a sidebar here. British Columbia LCFS treats multi-unit residential buildings differently. So basically, in the BC LCFS, and residential charging is very different under the BC LCFS. On the BC LCFS, single-family homes and I'll call it small multi-unit residential buildings, those 5 units and under, credit generation there goes to the utility. It's only if you have a large apartment or condo building that you're able to report in a residential context in BC.
Interesting. So there's a bit more like clarity there on who's actually eligible to claim that credit. Yeah. All right. In the public sector, first of all, is that sector eligible to generate credits? The example given is, municipalities that install EV chargers on municipal parking lots, transit agencies. Are there another obvious big one? Are they eligible?
Yes, municipalities are eligible. In fact, in some of the kind of supporting documentation when the program was initially released, ECCC used a transit agency as an example of a credit generating entity. And we have gotten confirmation from ECCC through multiple channels that municipalities, transit agencies, et cetera, are all eligible to generate to participate in this program.
Sure. All right, and then some more like off the wall questions in terms of the eligibility, but what about non-vehicle applications? So suppose a charging service is displacing diesel that would otherwise be used in a portable power generator. It's displacing road diesel, but not directly into the vehicle. Does that count too?
It does not. No, it has to be transportation fuel that is used for a transportation purpose. So something like a stationary generator, even a portable generator, would not fit that requirement.
Okay. All right. And then for the credits, because you mentioned a few times that in Canada, we have 2 different credit systems essentially working. Are they stackable?
Yes. If you have charging in British Columbia, you can generate credits under both the BC LCFS and the Canada CFR.
In terms of how you can allocate the funds for each of those different credit streams. Could you go through the differences again once more, just with where the funds, if it's specified where they need to go?
Yeah, so I mean, first, you can report in each program. You will generate separate credits under each program, and those credits are not fungible, right? So BC LCFS credits can only be sold and used within the BC LCFS market. Canada CFR credits can only be sold and used within the Canada CFR market. Those markets have different supply and demand and therefore pricing dynamics. So the value of those credits is going to be different. From a credit spend perspective, the one that is really prominent is this Canada CFR requirement for charging network operators. And that is something that needs to be reported to ECCC each year when your kind of credit generation report is submitted. But only the CFR spend needs to be, or only the CFR credit generation and value needs to be reported to them, right? So if you're also generating credits under the BC LCFS, that does not need to be reported to ECCC. Their mandate or coverage only applies to the CFR credit piece.
Okay, great. And then finally, we have questions about different vehicle types. So, is an electric ATV that's used by a university or an electric forklift, I'm assuming from that question, it's used in a commercial application, are those vehicles eligible to generate credits for the federal program?
An electric forklift is an ATV question mark. And I think I saw, based on the chat, it's something that gets plugged into a 110 volt outlet, and that probably would not qualify because there's not a smart charger that is dispensing that. Same thing with the forklift. You would need a smart charger that is capable of reading the amount of electricity that is dispensed into the forklift in order to be able to report. The other thing, and this is getting a little bit into the weeds on the program, but one detail that we did not talk about is the CFR has multiple different credit types. For the purposes of this discussion, almost everybody who has an EV that's being charged is going to generate compliance category 3 liquid class credits. However, a forklift would likely generate gaseous or gaseous class credits because typically in the forklift application, you're displacing propane rather than displacing diesel or gasoline. And so that's a different kind of credit. It carries different pricing dynamics because there's different requirements on how many can be used and those kinds of things. So that gets a little bit more complicated, but notionally, yes, a forklift should be able to participate in the program.
Good to get into the weeds. I mean, these are like important distinctions, helps people make, informed decisions. There are a few questions about alternative fuels and how and if they would qualify for a credit. So one is to do with hydrogen, and if that would be eligible, and the other is to do with renewable diesels produced in Canada, and if they would also fall under the credit system.
Yep. So yes, both hydrogen and renewable diesel would be eligible to generate credits. In fact, renewable diesel has generated quite a lot of credits under the program. Last year, I think the numbers that ECCC reported were about 1.25 billion liters of renewable diesel used in Canada and reported under the CFR. That's compared to a total diesel pool of about 7 billion liters. So a not insignificant portion of the fuel pool being made up by renewable diesel at this point. And as I mentioned, kind of as I was giving the answer before about regulatory change or government change, the Imperial Oil has plans to start producing 1 billion liters a year at a refinery that they're converting starting next year. So certainly something that is occurring in quite significant volumes already. Hydrogen, not as prevalent. And I saw the question was asking about hydrogen that is produced. It's important to note that the program focuses on hydrogen or any fuel that is actually used. So you'd have to report on the hydrogen that's actually dispensed into vehicles, and not kind of what is produced. But yes, it's eligible to qualify. No, there are no requirements on renewable content or things like that. Again, the carbon intensity of the fuel is important in determining how many credits are generated. So the cleaner the hydrogen is, the more credits it's going to generate. But there's not a minimum threshold, except I suppose that it needs to at least have an effective carbon intensity below the baseline. Otherwise, you wouldn't generate credits, you would generate deficits. So that would be the only restriction.
Right. And one of the last more complicated answer ones, and we'll move into a bit of a lightning round of yes, no's. Does 3 degrees work with specific charging networks? Is there a gateway, I guess, to being eligible to work with 3 degrees?
No, we're agnostic.
Okay, that was simpler than I thought. All right, great. So just some smaller, very specific questions. Are there any provincial credit systems other than the BC one that people could be eligible for?
Not of this type. There are biofuel blending mandates in other provinces, but not anything like a clean fuel standard.
Okay. Charges that are owned by an apartment building, but managed by a charge point operator. In that case, is the charge point operator eligible to claim the credit?
Most likely, yes, because
Okay.
they would be the one that would own the data. So therefore would be in first in line to generate credits.
It was mentioned that the charge needs to be a connected or a smart charger. Would an individually metered charger be eligible?
No.
And let's see if anything have come up in the last minute or two. Generally, I guess someone was interested in what kind of reform changes have happened in the US that you mentioned. Maybe a little preview of what's to come in Canada.
Yeah, so most of what has happened in the clean fuel standard programs in the US has actually been to make them more stringent. So right now, for example, California is going through an overhaul where the current target is a 20% reduction by 2030, and they're going to move to a 30% reduction by 2030. So they're actually making these programs a little bit more intense. But it's just as possible that things could go the other way, right? So right now, Canada's target is a 15%. Maybe that gets pushed back to a 10%, or something like that. That would be one way. There are also things that can happen. I'll say maybe more kind of technical or weedy within the regulation about like what's eligible for credit generation, what things are covered versus what aren't, what are the time frames with which entities can comply, are there alternative compliance mechanisms, things like that, that can all kind of, even if they don't change the headline target, that can make that target easier to meet.
Great. And last one, I truly cannot believe you got through this enormous pile of questions. Thank you for such succinct answers. Can the data be tracked upstream with an EVEMS versus a charger?
Again, I mean, they're pretty explicit that you got to have a smart charger to register. So anything other than that is going to have a hard time getting through.
But I appreciate everyone being very creative and asking if there's workarounds.
Yeah,
right.
and I wish there were more. As I mentioned in some of the other programs that we operate in, there is greater flexibility to do some of those things, get creative. Things like forklifts, for example, can be just very hard to meter. And so sometimes you have to get a little bit more creative on how you approach that. And most regulators basically say as long as you can kind of reliably prove the amount of electricity that's dispensed, that's sufficient. But it's explicitly written into the CFR regulation that it has to be a smart charger. And we've already gotten feedback from ECCC on that, basically saying like, yes, it has to be a smart charger or else we will not register it.
Right. Well, that's the big key takeaway learning today. The has to be a smart charger. If you have that, you know, you can work with it and find some solutions. Thank you so much, Dave and Scott, for your time and your insights. This has been really fascinating. I'm sure you're going to get bombarded with more questions, but we appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, thank you again for setting this up and having us on, and thanks to everybody who came out for the webinar. And yeah, feel free to reach out to myself or Scott with any follow-up questions that you have.